issues that are implicated by the term Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. And now, for the rest of the forum, we're going to delve deeply into each of these issues. And the first of those is aviation security. And it seems to me that it's entirely appropriate that the first one be aviation security for a number of reasons. One, we know that Al-Qaeda remains fixated on attacking the aviation sector. Two, for most Americans, I think it's fair to say that when they think of the Department of Homeland Security, they think aviation security. The face of the Department of Homeland Security for most Americans is TSA. And then finally, happily for TSA, for the department, and I would argue for the country, we finally now have a confirmed TSA administrator in John Pistol, the former deputy director of the FBI, who was confirmed on Friday. So I know that Tom Frank, who's moderating this session, will cover all of those issues with this fine panel. Tom Frank, as many of us know, covers Homeland Security for USA Today in Washington. He's been with that terrific paper since late 2004, coming from Newsday, where he spent 7 years covering politics and government, first on Long Island and then in Washington. He's done 4 reporting stints in Iraq and was an embedded reporter with the United States Army during the 2003 invasion of that country. He's also worked at the Denver Post here in Colorado, Providence Journal, and Easton Express in Pennsylvania. He also teaches journalism at the University of Maryland and is a graduate of Wesleyan University in Connecticut, and he lives in Washington, D.C. So with that, Tom Frank. Thank you very much, Tom.
Okay, thanks very much. I guess I'll introduce our guests here. This is a great panel of people who have been involved in aviation security since before people even realized there was aviation security. So to my immediate left is Jim May, who is president and CEO of the Air Transport Association, which represents major U.S. airlines. In the middle is Chris Bidwell, who is vice president of security and facilitation for the Airports Council International North America chapter, which represents airports. And sitting on the end is Erroll Southers, who is Associate Director of the Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorist Events at the University of Southern California. Erroll also was the first nominee of President Obama to head the TSA, and also spent many years working as a law enforcement agent with the FBI, and most recently for the police department at the Los Angeles airports, where he was head of Homeland Security. So I was reminded during the previous discussion of something that probably a lot of people forgot about, which is this color-coded system that has been, it seems, fixed at yellow, which is the middle of the 5 categories for I don't know how many years. But for aviation, and for aviation only, the threat level is at orange, which is the second highest. And I'm wondering, why is that? Why is the entire country considered at a moderately risky level, but aviation is considered a high-risk level? Erroll, you've been in this, you have a security clearance. Tell us.
Well, Tom, quite frankly, as you all know, aviation security is the most hardened infrastructure since 9/11. Yet it remains an incredibly lucrative target. There's a high utility for it. It is a transportation modality that is still vulnerable. It presents an opportunity, if you will, for significant economic loss in terms of return on investment. There is an opportunity there for a high number of casualties. And most importantly, if successful, I think it serves to undermine the public confidence in what we're doing in the way of Homeland Security.
But given the billions and billions that have been invested in aviation security, just the creation of the TSA, all the technology that was talked about before, why is it still, does that mean that this investment has not been successful or has fallen short if aviation is still considered a higher risk?
I think that, again, aviation is going to remain a very high target in terms of terrorists. We've seen an evolution of methodology to place IEDs on planes. We've seen in different attack paths attempted all over the world. Since 1960, there have now been more than 60 attacks on airport structures. There have been 9 active shooting incidents, of which at LAX we were victim of in 2002 ourselves. So aviation remains a very lucrative target in the minds of the terrorist.
Chris and Jim, do you agree or disagree?
Look, the Christmas Day bomber was less than 6 months ago. There was an event in India, attempt to hijack an aircraft in January of this year. So I think it's a very current threat, and I think the level of orange is appropriate.
Absolutely, Tom. And you know, Erroll made some great comments, but to expand upon that, aviation is something that the terrorists revisit and they do so routinely, there's a certain mystique about air travel and the psychological impact if, given the investment that we have put in aviation security is huge if they're successful. And that translates also into a significant economic impact, something that terrorists want to see, is to deal a decisive economic blow to this country.
So is there almost an irony in investing billions and billions of dollars and billions of employee hours that just makes it all that much more inviting? Because if a terrorist can take down a plane, then they could say, look, you did the TSA and it's even a bigger failure.
What's your alternative?
To more
Look, you acknowledge that aviation is a central focus for threat. There are ample examples of that, both real and attempted. You have to make the investment to protect not only the flying public, but the reality of terrorists using aircraft as a weapon. And so I don't think you have any alternative but to make these investments and do the best job you humanly know how to do. As someone suggested, we may not end up being perfect in this. And Abu Matalib was an example of somebody that was missed overseas. But the reality is you have to make sure that we can assure the flying public that we're doing everything we know how to do to assure and secure a safe flying environment.
Did you want to?
Well, there's an interesting individual named Abu Qurashi. He's an online pro-Al-Qaeda commentator, and he speaks to this fourth generation warfare strategy in his, if you will, global jihadi movement. And he believes that continued attacks, particularly on aviation, tend to undermine our efforts at detecting attacks, deterring attacks, and most importantly, defending against attacks, and believes that over time, they will wear down the American public and undermine our public confidence. So the strategy here is very clear, and Jim is correct. We get in a very short timeline here in the West of 8 years, 10 years. We're working with people that work on a 2,000-year timeline for successful completion. So 8 years or so is a very short timeline in terms of whether we should turn back the clock or tone down the color.
So let's talk about the threats to aviation, to the U.S. aviation system in the last 8 years. You had, as you mentioned, the Abdul Muttalib case, which was the Nigerian man who boarded a plane first, I believe, in Nigeria, flew to Amsterdam, boarded a Northwest Airlines flight going to Detroit, and tried unsuccessfully to set off bombs that he had hidden in his underwear. You had, in August 2006, the liquid bombs plot that was uncovered in the UK. And then going back, I think it was late 2001, Richard Reed, the shoe bomber who boarded an airplane in Paris headed for the US. 3 events, all involving international aviation. Why is international aviation now seemingly a target?
I don't think it's now seemingly a target. I think the greatest threat to aviation has always originated overseas. And so I don't think that's different.
But you're talking now, the 9/11, obviously, those are all domestic flights. And now you're talking about flights originating, all of them, in Europe.
Right.
Is that just pure coincidence? At USA Today, 3 is a pattern. So is that not a pattern?
It could be a pattern, but I think the reality is that the threat is principally today from overseas coming into the United States. And ultimately, the 9/11 bombers originated outside of the United States, came here, spent time here. It was a well-planned, well-executed plot, which is different than Abu Muttalib. But the threat is from overseas into the United States. And I think that has consistently been the case.
Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I think you have to look at this question in terms of where the terrorists get their training. And there's a greater concentration of those who have been trained outside the U.S. because of the systems that we have in place to prevent them from getting into the U.S. Now, having said that, in answer to your question, is it a pattern? Well, it could be, it could pose a challenge if we say, yes, it is a pattern, and then we focus almost exclusively on international and, don't focus enough on the domestic system, which we clearly have to do as evidenced by 9/11.
I think perhaps there's even a larger concept to that. You mentioned Richard Reed and Abdul Muttalib. In 1991, Ramzi Youssef was responsible, if you will, or 1993 for the World Trade Center first attack. And then in 1995, he was able to put together liquid nitroglycerin in a contact lens container, get on a Philippines jet. That was a successful attack. It didn't gain much public notoriety because that plane landed successfully. 6 years later, Richard Reed gets on a plane with PETN and TATP. Again, an evolution in terms of methodology and what kinds of ingredients can get through airport screening. 8 years later, Abdul Muttalib gets on a plane with PETN. So what you're seeing here over a long range of things, if you will, is an experimentation on their part to see what kinds of ingredients can get through screening. And I think it's a larger scope and a larger issue. Again, we get into these short timelines. We're looking at here now since over 14 years or so where they've changed and evolved. And they've been successful each time in getting it on the plane. So that troubles me more than perhaps where the origins of the flight are. It's more the evolution of their methodology to get IEDs on aircraft.
And I want to get to body scanners in a minute, but I also do want to talk about the efforts that the Deputy Secretary referred to try to improve security at international airports. But first, Chris, tell me, what is security like at international airports? There are about 100 airports with direct flights to the U.S. A lot of the flights come from Europe and Asia, but they also come from countries that don't have as strong security. Give us the lay of the land. What's the worst security at the worst airport like, and how easy is it to beat? I mean, as the Secretary said, the Deputy Secretary said, once you get in the aviation system, it doesn't matter where you get in. You could get in at Pitkin County Airport, you're in, and you can go anywhere. And that's sort of saying that the security system is only as good as the weakest link. So what's the lay of the land out there?
Well, the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, prescribes standards that for aviation security that foreign countries and by de facto foreign airports have to comply with. So there is that standard out there. And it's not completely accurate to say that when you're in the system, you're in the system, because if you look at Abdul Muttalib, he was screened multiple times before he got on the Northwest Airlines flight out of Amsterdam. So, different countries have different systems in place. They comply with the standards. Some go above the standards, implement random security measures, and, some of them are at the baseline, but they're all in compliance with the requirements that are mandated.
Can I note that one of the lessons learned from the Christmas Day event was that carriers, U.S. carriers, have assumed responsibility for increasing the level of security at many high-risk airports around the world, be they in Asia, South America, but particularly the African nations. And so we are deploying on our own hook AIT, trace explosives detection, et cetera, to increase that level because we weren't satisfied that it was appropriate.
But there's still lots of non-U.S. carriers that fly to the U.S. that aren't necessarily going to do that. You talked about the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Standard. Compare that to the TSA standard. I know people talk about TSA as being sort of the gold standard. Is the TSA standard, how much higher is it than the ICAO standard?
TSA standards are in line with the ICAO standards, but again, I mean, the individual countries have the flexibility to go above and beyond the standards set by ICAO. And TSA does that in many different respects. And I guess going back to your previous question about airports, international airports, unlike the US, are responsible for procuring and implementing the security systems, meaning the various technologies used to screen passengers and baggage, and in certain cases, actually operating those systems. So, when you look at the impact of the requirements that resulted from December 25th, The international airports were uniquely impacted in that they're the ones that had to procure the technologies. They're the ones who had to implement the additional or enhanced measures for flights going to the U.S. in concert with the air carriers.
And you're talking about the emergency protocols that were put in place for about a month or two,
Right.
and those were subsequently dropped. But a lot of airports, the deputy secretary and the secretary traveled all over the world trying to, as the deputy secretary said, elevate international aviation security, partly by improving technology. The main focus has been on the body scanners. But a lot of countries haven't done that. They haven't done it. First of all, a lot of European countries just don't like those machines. They have privacy concerns. And then a lot of other countries simply can't afford them. And you heard the deputy say, I think her comment was, stronger members of the system have to help weaker members, which I assume means pay for things. So it seems that you still have a patchwork out there.
But I guess first off, the enhanced security measures put in place at international airports for flights coming to the U.S., although they evolved, there were 3 generations, we're on the 3rd generation, they're still in place. Just to clarify that.
Okay, but there is no mandate that foreign airports with direct flights to the U.S. have body scanners.
There's no mandate specifically for body scanners, but there is a mandate for enhanced security measures, which could entail body scanners. It could entail explosive trace detection to screen passengers and or their bags, or other variations of technology to include physical inspection.
Let's just talk for a second about the challenges of elevating security at international airports that are not obviously governed by the Homeland Security Department or the TSA. Erroll, what are the challenges? What is the TSA or the Homeland Security Department's leverage, first of all? And what are the challenges to improve security, not just at Heathrow and Schiphol, but at the airports in Jamaica and countries that don't have a lot of money to invest in security and so forth?
Well, I would imagine the ultimate, if you will, response would be to deny flights into United States airspace that don't comply with the standards that we set. And that was done after the Christmas Day event, where at least one African nation was denied flight. I believe it was from Egypt for a while, where they couldn't fly into United States airspace. So that can be done. As Chris mentioned, the most important thing is harmonizing these standards and making sure that they meet that level. We can't compromise on that. It has to be done. And technology has got to be a way to enhance human capital. The unfortunate thing is, as the Deputy Secretary mentioned earlier, is we look for this silver bullet. I'm in a center that does an incredible amount of work on risk. There is no zero-based risk solution for terrorism. That is something that we have to educate the American public about. And as we increasingly spend billions of dollars on this effort, and people make sacrifices, meaning the traveling public, both domestic and international, their tolerance level for, if you will, failures or successes is going to be reduced. They expect a higher level of, if you will, success on our part. So we've gotten to the point now where a failed attack is almost assailed as a failure, instead of it being a success that perhaps an alert citizen notified someone and the system worked its way through to finally apprehend that individual. So we've got to make sure that those standards internationally meet our standards, and more importantly, that technology is used as an enhancement. The Israelis are very good at what they do because they have an incredible workforce. The technology enhances the workforce, not vice versa.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the technology. The TSA and the Homeland Security Department are in the process of installing several hundred of these body scanners. Maybe some of you have been through them. 1,000 in total. They're probably at about 50 airports now. I think by the end of next year, they'll be at every major airport in the U.S. In many of the airports, they will be in what is called primary screening, meaning that you will go through those machines as an alternative, or not as an alternative, but instead of going through the metal detectors. I want to talk about how effective these machines are. One important note is that the machines, so far at least, are always voluntary, meaning that any airline passenger can say, no thanks, I don't want to go through one of those machines, I want to go through the old metal detector. And those passengers who decline will also get a pat-down. But the pat-downs don't pat down everywhere. So sure, it's great, as the Deputy Secretary says, they absolutely improve our ability to detect, but are they improving the ability to detect the change in the keys innocent travelers leave in their pockets? And couldn't a smart terrorist who understands the system simply figure out, all right, first step, don't go through the body scanners. Second step, put the explosives where I know the aviation screeners won't pat down. What good are these actually doing to stop the smart terrorists, which are the people we have to worry about?
Well, I think the advanced imaging technology units that you're speaking about, they're a quantum leap forward in passenger screening technology. I mean, if you look at what we've used since basically 1974, it's been the walk-through metal detector. And walk-through metal detectors do not detect non-metallic items hidden on the person. And to the Deputy Secretary's point, this is a non-automated technology. Therefore,
And by that you mean non-automated means what?
It means it does not automatically identify the item of concern for the operator. And the TSA transportation security officers are effectively trained on operating this technology, but the technology is only as good as the individual operating it. So it can be very effective in helping to identify items of concern that the traditional walk-through metal detectors cannot detect.
Right, but the technology is also only as good as the system, what they call the ConOps, the concept of operations and how it works. And it's still voluntary everywhere. So again, if a smart terrorist can say, I'm not going through one of these, what good, how does it stop smart terrorists?
So two things. There is work at the TSA Technical Center in Atlantic City to work with the manufacturers right now to develop automated target recognition. This is something that would automatically identify the suspect items on the individual for additional screening. The first version of that software is hopefully going to be available later this year. That will address privacy concerns as well as enhance security, because it will not show the image of the individual any longer, just a stick figure in the location of the item. To your second question, although individuals or passengers are provided the opportunity to opt out of screening through the advanced imaging technology, there are other layers of security in place that TSA has, whether they're random explosive detection canine patrols, both in the public and the sterile area, and then the use of explosive trace detection systems to screen hands, both in the queue lines at security checkpoints, then the pat-downs at the security checkpoints, and then the pat-downs and the explosive trace detection that is utilized on a random basis at boarding gates.
Jim, let me ask you, should these machines be mandatory, or should they always remain optional for airline passengers?
My own personal view is they ought to be mandatory. But that said, we have to live within the privacy regime rules that we live within, and so we have to make accommodations. These new machines, advanced imaging, effectively show anomalies to the skin of the individual. I think there is a reasonable chance they would have detected Abu Matalib. Not a guarantee. But as Chris points out, if you choose not to take advantage of that technology, we have explosives trace, we have mobile explosives trace, and there are new generations of AIT that are coming on stream as we sit here in
Do you think the
today.
TSA is moving toward making them mandatory?
I can't. You would have to ask TSA that question. I don't know the answer to it, but the point I think we're trying to make here is to reinforce what the Secretary said this morning. These are quantum leaps forward in terms of imaging technology, and they do a terrific job that 5 years ago we would have thought, boy, this is the Holy Grail. We're not satisfied that we have gone as far as we need to go. But I think the key here is that we have a much better system than we ever have had in the past.
Let's talk about another issue that has been raised by the last two attempts, by the Abdul Muttalib case and also the Shahzad case in Times Square, where he actually managed to get on an airplane, even though he was at some point put on the no-fly list. So the no-fly list is a list of about 6,000 names of people. It's a very small subset of the overall government terrorist watch list, which has about 500,000 names. And another subset is what's called the selectee list, which has about 25,000 names, and those are people who are allowed on airplanes, but only after they get additional screening. After these two events, there has been a lot of discussion that maybe these lists should be more robust, maybe more people should be on these lists. Erroll, can you tell us why isn't, you hear this a lot, why is someone possibly on the terrorist watch list but not on the selectee list or no-fly list? And segue into whether these lists should be expanded.
That's a good question. And you would expect people, intelligently speaking, to be on both, but I will just at least speak to the solution. The Immigration Advisory Program was just adopted, I believe, last month. That's a program where CBP is going to be looking at passenger data overseas. And the immediate agreement we have right now is with France, where we'll be looking at people and even at the airport at the last moment denying them the ability to fly. Secure Flight now is looking at watch lists before people get to the airport, and hopefully that will enhance the system. But one would think, you're right, that the lists would be compatible. Those lists are incredibly problematic. And adding people to those lists, if in fact the databases and technical infrastructure supporting them can do the appropriate name screening so that there's no misnames or no misspellings or no accidents, and again, there's no such thing as no. Those kinds of things can be enhanced. We do have to do a better job of finding the bomber instead of the bomb. And I think those lists are certainly something that's going to be helpful.
Well, I think one concern historically has been that there may be people that you don't want too many names on the no-fly or the selectee list, because then you're going to potentially clog up airport checkpoints. Jim, what do you think? Should the no-fly lists and selectee lists be expanded? They've sort of waxed and waned depending on the mood of the times, and now there's a lot of sense that they should be enlarged. What's your thought?
That's not a question for airlines to answer, in particular as we have now transitioned to what Erroll mentioned a minute ago, which is the Secure Flight program. Prior to really a month ago, when we went 100% secure flight, we were checking against those lists. The airlines had the responsibility to check against those lists. Now it's the federal government that creates, maintains those lists. It's the federal government does the checking. They then notify the carrier. You can green light, you can give a boarding pass to this individual, or you can't. And if you can't, then there is a resolution process that goes into place.
So in Secure Flight, you're talking about the system that for years and years, it's been the airlines that have done the pre-screening where they check your name against the terrorist watch list or some watch list that they get. And as of a few weeks ago, after years of trying, the TSA has finally taken over that task. But for domestic flights only so far, the TSA will take over for international flights fully by the end of the year.
Yes, and the international program is called AQQ, APIS Quick Query. And it is in place for many international carriers, not all today. It's not mandatory yet, but I think this is a huge, again, leap forward in identifying individuals. And arguably, the government has the ability to check against more than one simple list.
What about a trusted traveler program? This has been discussed since, really since the days after 9/11, when Congress was putting together the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, which created the CSA and a lot of other things. The thinking was, we're all not terrorists, we're safe people, and why do we have to stand in this crazy long line, and isn't the TSA wasting its time screening you and me and all of you, and shouldn't there be some program whereby travelers can submit whatever background information is necessary, prove to the world, to the TSA, that they're not terrorists, and then basically get an expedited pass through security. That's been talked about, and it's never really gotten off the ground. Chris, is there a place for that, for some kind of trusted traveler program?
I think there is, but not in its current format. I mean, what we have out there right now, the registered traveler program, is there's no background check associated with it, and you're really just paying to go to the front of the line. And that's fine. I mean, if airports want to do that and it's an efficiency there, then it's their choice, proprietors' rights. But I think there is a real opportunity to design a system that incorporates different vetting mechanisms of the individual on a voluntary basis to address the privacy concerns, that involves a background check to allow the vetted individuals to go through a baseline, but then other individuals that you don't know as much about might be categorized for additional screening. And that is something that has worked very effectively in Israel. Granted, it's an apples and oranges comparison to compare their system with ours because ours is so much bigger, but it has worked very effectively, and I think there's an opportunity to implement some system like that here in the U.S.
And there is a program that exists for Customs and Border for immigration that is a expedited biometric program when you come back into the United States for those that have paid. I think it's a $200 fee, and it works extremely well. But the point Chris is making, I think, is key. If there is a real means of expediting those people who are known to the federal government, have had background checks, have biometric information attached to their system, that's great. But if all it is a program where you pay $100 or $200 to go to the front of the line, then I don't think it's accomplishing a public policy goal.
So it seems to make sense to everyone, to people up here, which we constitute everyone, to Congress. What's kept it from ever happening? It never, I mean, the program that got off the ground under the previous administration, as you say, it wasn't a security program. It was just a skip the awful security line, but go through the same program. Erroll, any sense what's kept this from, and the former secretary's been here, maybe we could ask him, but what's kept it from getting off the ground if it seems intuitively right?
Well, I think you just spoke to it. It was the security issue was not addressed, and I think that has to be paramount. Jim's talking about the Global Entry Program, which is at CBP. I'm a member of Global Entry. They've done a survey, and 75% of those members have said they come back into the country in 5 minutes or less. At LAX, when you go to Customs, there are 5 to 6 Global Entry kiosks there, and typically when I've gone in there, they've been empty. And it's quite a reasonable fee. It's for 5 years. But the vetting process is done by the government. The database is maintained by the government. So therein lies some public trust in terms of a system that's going to exist and going to be vetted. Chris is talking about iPass in Israel. And they have that at Ben Gurion. They're doing it for domestic. But that, again, relies on a system where a person that's going out domestically, once they scan their passport, their hand, and their biometrics on their facial recognition, there's a queue that they can't step out of, so they're able to walk through. I think the system has to be first and paramount based on the security requirements that are there, and then secondly, even with a vetted population, a system that once you're in it, we re-vet that population periodically. I think that's critical. But most importantly, what it's going to give TSA the ability to do with a vetted population of 100 people that are now Global Entry members, I'm sorry, if you have 100 people in a room and 20 are Global Entry members, I have to worry about the other 80 because I've got this vetted population. Now we're talking about an agency that could be risk-based and perhaps intelligence-driven and not take the 90-year-old person and put them in secondary screening unnecessarily.
And Tia, Chris, go ahead.
Just bottom line answer to the question is there was never a background check developed that gave us collectively a confidence level to allow passengers to go through with a lower level of screening than everybody else.
Can you even conceivably develop a background check? Or there's this talk of clean-skinned terrorists, people who they have no background that would raise any alarms,
right.
And then maybe even after they get their background check, they become radicalized. Is it conceivable to give someone this sort of elevated sort of security clearance and say, we trust you because we've looked into your background and all you do on the weekends is go to a little league soccer, whatever. Is it conceivable?
I think there's a potential for that, but like Erroll said, it needs to be based upon perpetual vetting.
And I'd like to be crystal clear that a person that's a member of this, if you will, registered traveler should not be barred from screening. That just means that person
Right.
goes through a line and they're still subject to some kind of security screening at the checkpoint.
So you mentioned something about the TSA trying to become more risk-based, and the previous administrator, Kip Hawley, I think did a lot toward that goals, and one of his signature programs is behavior detection, which is now in place at just about every major airport. They try to keep it a little secret, but if it's pretty easy to, while you're in security line, to find the screener who's kind of standing there with his hands behind his back checking you out. And the idea of the program is to train security screeners, transportation security officers, to observe passengers from a little bit of a distance and to try to find those who are exhibiting some kind of suspicious behavior. It could be through their appearance, through their actions, or any number of things. And yet, the Government Accountability Office came out with a report about a month ago saying that that technique had never been validated, meaning the TSA can't say whether it has any better chance of pulling aside a terrorist through behavior detection as if it just chose people randomly and subjected them to additional questioning or scrutiny. So I guess the question is behavior detection, is this for real or is this a sham? Erroll.
I'll give you some personal experiences because I know the report was pretty dismal. Behavioral detection officers at LAX, which was one of the 4 airports I was responsible for, did stand in those locations, as you mentioned, and their activity was pretty much as you described. We were able to use them in a whole host of things. Again, we've got to reverse engineer this whole attack path process. If I'm a terrorist, am I willing to lose my investment on my attacker and my IED before it gets to where we need it to go? So we use behavioral detection officers at vehicle checkpoints, curbside, terminals, parking structures, every place a human being might be before they even get to the place where they need to have their boarding pass. That, I think, is a much more effective use of it. When we used it at our vehicle checkpoints, they supplemented our officers, our canine officers, and other people out there, and quite often they weren't looking at the driver, they were looking at the other occupants of the vehicle, and quite often we were able to make some pretty interesting discoveries. So I think perhaps an enhanced use of behavioral detection beyond the gate and beyond the terminal might be something that they'll look at doing in the future. But I do know the report was pretty dismal, unfortunately.
But whether you use it at the checkpoint queue or in the parking lot or anywhere, the question is, how does anyone know it works? How does it know that if you look in a car and you say, well, this person looks suspicious, is that any better than saying, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, you, come out? There is, as the GAO said, and a number of social scientists have said, there has been no scientific validation of this. How do you know it actually works?
Without a baseline metric to compare it to, you don't. And you're absolutely, and I'm not vetting their program for them, believe me. But I am saying that in the instances we've been able to use it, we found it to be helpful.
At the same time, though, this program is in its relative infancy, needs to be given a chance to evolve. And if you look at the results of the program to date, there have been a number of criminals that have been identified through this, a number of drug traffickers, and a number of individuals that had fraudulent identification. So there is an aspect of it that is working.
Well,
And as Kip Hawley said, this is not the be-all, end-all. This is one layer in a much broader approach to aviation security. And so from our perspective, I think it has every opportunity to work as they look at better ways, as Erroll pointed out, to deploy the BDOs. And I would suggest to you it's been, what, not even 2 full years since they were originally deployed, and I think there is good opportunity to have optimism that this is a worthwhile layer of security.
So you're confident that it's not, that there is some validity to it,
Yes.
and if they're arresting people who are carrying extra cash and extra drugs or whatever, that there's some basis instead of, I mean, if you pulled aside 1,000 people randomly at any airport, some of them are going to be up to no good.
Sure.
And again, it goes to the point, how do you know that this program hits any better than some random point? But it sounds like you all are supportive of it and want to see it continue.
I'm supportive of the concept. I'd like to see them continue to work on more aggressive ways to deploy the technology and, or in this case, psychology.
Okay.
And don't throw it out.
Let's talk a little about where TSA is going and tie this in with the recent confirmation of John Pistol, who is a career law enforcement guy, was the number 2 at the FBI, a much different background from his predecessor, Kip Hawley, who came from the logistics area. And I wonder, Erroll, you were also nominee, and you came with an extensive law enforcement background. Is the TSA, if you look at this, the nomination of Pistol, the confirmation of Pistol, and a lot of other things that the TS is doing, like the behavior detection, or even like giving them new uniforms with the metal police-style badges, is TSA becoming more of a law enforcement agency, and is the Pistol confirmation part of that?
Well, TSA has a number of law enforcement responsibilities. I think that Pistol's confirmation speaks to the fact that there are some bridges that are already built between law enforcement, federal, state, and local, the intelligence community, perhaps even the military community if that's necessary. I see it as a very positive confirmation because that's an individual that can walk in the room and people know. They know the agency that he comes from. I think it enhances TSA's capabilities and, if you will, their role, since they are the largest component in DHS, in going forward to try to deal with probably the most formidable threat, being that the threat to transportation. So I think it speaks well and bodes well that you'd have a person with that kind of background leading the organization.
The first, if you go back, it's only a few years, but it seems like an eternity, the first TSA administrator was John McGaugh, who also came from a law enforcement background. He was the longtime head of the Secret Service. And there were some concerns that his approach was too focused on law enforcement and not enough on the sort of customer service aspect of aviation security, and the recognition that part of what the TSA has to do is not just stop terrorists, but also allow aviation to continue as a business. Jim, do you have any concerns that TSA might be going back to a direction where it's focusing far too much on the law enforcement aspect and not enough on the sheer commerce aspect of air transport?
I don't know Mr. Pistol. I know he's got a long and distinguished career with the FBI. He gets sworn in tomorrow, it's my understanding. He's got a very strong counter-terrorism background. And I think all of those augur well. When he goes to TSA, you are absolutely right. He needs to have a customer focus as well. And finally, he needs to be just a heck of a good manager for many different kinds of disciplines. I give him the benefit of the doubt and say we look forward to having him come on board.
Let's talk a little bit about the future of TSA. I know that, Chris, you've talked about some concerns that as air traffic continues to grow and grow and grow, how do you accommodate that the additional passengers who are going through the screening checkpoints, which aren't necessarily growing? There's a real estate issue there. Talk about your concern about the future of aviation security and how you actually accommodate what's going to be, hopefully, you all assume, the continued growth.
In consideration of the predictions by the Federal Aviation Administration for 1 billion passengers annually by, I think it's 2025 right now, when you look at the aviation security system we currently have in place, it's space constrained, as you already said, because each airport, when you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport. Each checkpoint is different. There's limited amounts of real estate. That is something that's been identified as we look to deploy the advanced imaging technology units to the checkpoints. It's very manpower intensive, and there needs to be a process for the technology to evolve. But right now, we've got kind of a perfect storm developing, if you will, in that space limitations with the deployment of the advanced imaging technology units, there are additional TSA transportation security officers or screeners necessary to operate that technology. And then you've got a significant increase right now in the number and size of carry-on bags. And taken together, I think that's possible that it's going to drive additional delays or wait times at the checkpoint.
To that point, very specifically, we've had a concern that the throughput for AIT technology is much slower than body scanners is much slower than it is for just straight metal detection, and that's true. But the overall processing right now is being driven not by the time it takes to get through the body scanner, if you will, but by the time it takes to get through the checked bag, which is going through the normal process. Why? Because airlines, I know this will come as a shocker, are actually charging bag fees. So people are carrying more bags on board and they're packing them more tightly. So the net result is that TSA is having to spend more time on the check bag, and that's what's driving the metric for how long it takes people to get through. The TSA will tell you that they're looking at a 10-minute average as their golden rule. And right now, it probably is pretty accurate to say it's 10 minutes going through, but it is going to be challenged as a result of these changes, not only with more people flying, but with more people taking carry-on bags.
So what's the answer? I mean, obviously the airlines have some responsibility, because to the extent that airlines are charging for check bags, as you say, people are not checking bags. What's the answer?
I think the answer is to continue to work on improved technology, to continue to work on new advanced imaging technology, generation 5, 6, and 7, to do a better job of doing detection for bags, and just continue to move forward.
There are a couple answers to that question. I mean, I agree, technology enhancements, we need to get the advanced technology X-ray, which presents a dual view of the bag, which helps TSA screeners discriminate between items that may or may not be a concern, and it reduces the number of potential bag alarms that have to be resolved. So get that technology out there. The other thing is there needs to be enforcement of the 1+1 carry-on limitation. That's been in place for quite some time, but when you look out there in practical terms, it's not really being enforced. And then, there's other things that we can look at as an industry. One of the things that in previous years, prior to 9/11, certain airlines installed baggage sizers when the airlines were responsible for screening of passengers in their carry-on bags. So that's something that TSA could look at potentially. Clearly it would be something that we'd have to discuss as an industry.
Who's responsible for enforcing the 1+1?
The airlines.
Do they enforce it?
We do in some instances, not in others. And others would argue that it's TSA going through, because that's where the sizer is, going through the belt. So that's a challenge that we've got to step up to the plate to meet. I think another challenge that we ought to ask DHS and TSA to take a look at is it time to change the liquids rule?
Is it?
I think it is.
Well, are liquids still not a threat? The rule was put in place for a reason. What has changed about the threat to eliminate that?
If you're going to aggressively enforce it, fine. If you're not, then I think there are other ways to check against liquids.
When you say if they're going to aggressively enforcement, fine.
I think there are ample examples where the little baggie has been left inadvertently in the bag and TSA has never asked to take it out. I think there are other examples where you've got liquids in small quantities that you're taking with your carry-on. And I think those are challenges that we have to work with TSA to address.
Erroll, do you agree? Is it safe at this point? I mean, this is really a security regulation. It's not a convenience regulation. How safe do you think it would be to lift or somehow ease the liquid restriction?
Well, there's two things. We're currently engaged in a project with Technion Institute in Haifa, looking at
Haifa, Israel?
Haifa, Israel, looking at peroxide-based explosives, looking at liquid bombs. That's one thing. So to say that that threat doesn't exist, it does. Second, here again is another opportunity for us to engage and engender some public confidence by looking at this as a transnational issue. The European Union is going to lift the liquid threat in March of 2013. We should be doing that together. For one continent to do it at one time and another at another time doesn't give the traveler much confidence that the person's doing it first is ready to go.
But would it be safe to lift this? I mean, as I say, those were put in for a reason. If you were head of TSA and you were the person that was going to have to be called to testify in front of 108 committees or whatever the number is, would you feel confident saying, sure, bring all the bottles and liquids you want through? Would you feel comfortable doing that?
With all due respect, I think we should wait 24 hours and ask the new administrator that question.
Okay. There's another deadline coming up, August 1st, which is for screening cargo. Just a little bit of background. I think 3 years ago, the Congress passed a law that, among other things, said that all cargo, not luggage, but cargo, freight, that goes on passenger planes has to be screened for explosives. That's caused a lot of concern because that's a lot of cargo, and any given flight you may be taking from Denver back to Washington or New York, about half of what's in the belly of the plane is likely to be cargo, whether that's food, flowers, computers, auto parts, or something, and it's not now screened. As of August 1st, it all has to be screened. First of all, is that deadline going to be met? And if so or if not, what's the consequences? There's been a lot of concern that it's going to be impossible to meet. It's going to shut down the sort of just-in-time, get things overnight commerce we have.
One modification first to your preamble. Narrow-bodied aircraft, that is single-aisle aircraft, have had the requirement. We are in 100% compliance for those narrow-body aircraft, and that's been for a number of months now. The wide-body aircraft have a requirement to be 100% compliant by the 1st of August of this year. We will make that goal, but it's not without some very significant disruptions to the process. It's not without a lot of hard work on the part of a lot of people, including TSA. And the real challenge is that on wide-body aircraft, those cargo shipments tend to be palletized in much larger pallets, and there is no effective screening technology to screen an entire pallet at one time.
What is a pallet?
4 by 8 skid.
4 feet by 8 feet.
Right.
Skid meaning?
I don't want to get into it. The key is it's a unitized load.
So it's basically a big box.
It's already secured. It's got netting on it. What we want to be able to do is find a way to not have to break down those palletized loads every time we need to double check that we've done explosive trace detection. So the key is to drive a lot of that security upstream in the process, where the people who actually pack that, high-end electronics manufacturers, prescription drug manufacturers, raw agricultural products, flowers, fish, things of that sort, can do the detection inspections at the front end of that process and then guarantee the supply chain coming down so that we can more effectively meet that. It's called the Certified Shipper Program. And one of the good things that DHS and TSA are doing are working with companies around the world to get them engaged in that Certified Shipper Program.
So you're confident this deadline will be met?
I am confident that U.S. carriers will meet this deadline as projected on the 1st of August of this year. It will take a bit longer for international carriers, and it won't come without some disruption.
Talk about the disruption.
The rule doesn't apply to all cargo shippers. if you're a shipper and you want to make sure that your product is not going to be broken down, you can ship it on FedEx or UPS and not have to go through this regime.
I think we're ready to take questions, so if anyone has a question, raise a hand, and we will get the mics. So let's start right here. Mics, yeah, keep your hand up. And if you would quickly introduce yourself, that would be great.
Is there a technology or some way that can help those of us that have like plates, screws in our bodies, that we don't have to go through all this process? I had originally a doctor had given me a certificate, but they don't even look at it.
They don't care about it. Well, excellent
But there
question.
should
A lot
be.
of people have that. Will Chris or Erroll, will the body scanners help people like this woman who have an artificial hip or something?
Absolutely. I think there's real potential for the advanced imaging technology units to address just that challenge. I know personally others who constantly go through the walk-through metal detectors and they're pulled aside for additional screening, but now they volunteer to go through the advanced imaging technology units so they don't have to be taken to secondary for the pat-down.
Yeah. Other questions? Right here with, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, you've focused mostly on threats from inside the passenger cabin, and so my question is about twofold. One is the threat of planes being shot down, and the other is luggage. Specifically, there are lots of other ways of getting things in there. Also, parenthetically, a year ago, TSA stole 2 of my iPhones from my luggage.
Okay. When you talk about shot down, you're talking about surface-to-air missiles?
Shoulder fired or
Shoulder-fired.
or a 50 caliber, things like that.
Right. Well, I know that the TSA, or the Homeland Security Department, has been testing that for a long time. It's a very expensive proposition. And you want to talk about what the TSA has been doing and maybe some of the challenges with outfitting a lot of planes with a lot of expensive equipment.
This is it's a long, raging debate between airlines, security experts, any of a number of providers to the system over whether or not the rewards for the potential risk are worth it to equip passenger aircraft with basically detection equipment to work against surface-to-air missiles, shoulder-fired weapons. As a practical matter, I think the consensus opinion is that the costs far exceed the rewards, and there's nothing out there that will protect against 50 caliber machine gun fire, for instance, and many of the shoulder-fired weapons are not going to be stopped by a lot of this infrared technology. So right now, that's sort of the state of play. I can't help you with your iPod.
Can you talk about how much of a threat is this actually, that someone is going to park themselves outside of the airport and just fire and knock one of these things, a plane down?
Well, Jim is right. It's one of the first studies we did at Create. You're talking about man-pads, man-portable aerial defense systems, shoulder-fired missiles. And the frequency, albeit, is relatively low. However, we know that there is a fair amount out there on the market. We provided thousands to the Mujahideen when they were fighting the Russians, and they're there. Albeit for a new accelerant and a new battery, they become operational. So it is a threat that we pay attention to, but Jim's right. In terms of a cost-effective and risk analysis study, it wasn't cost-effective to outfit every aircraft and maintain that equipment on every aircraft to protect the flying public. So there are other measures that are in place to address that issue.
As to the second question, I thought was an interesting one. There has been a lot of focus up here and within TSA, DHS on keeping passengers from taking explosives on planes and not so much on luggage. Is there a sense that luggage is more or less safe now? I mean, every piece of luggage is screened. Chris, what's your sense? Should we be more concerned about passengers taking things on board hidden on their body as opposed to putting a bomb on a plane?
Given the recent the recent attempted terrorist attack on Christmas Day, I think there is a need to focus more on passengers than bags. But when you look at checked baggage, all checked baggage has been screened through electronic means, whether that's explosive trace detection or the explosive detection systems, the big minivan size units that are in airport lobbies and in the baggage systems for quite some time. So there is a means to screen all checked baggage.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Let's go in the back.
Hi, my name is Carrie Lamack, excuse me, with Families of September 11. And I have a question for you about engaging the public in aviation security. We heard Jane Lute talk about resiliency of the American public as one of the DHS's top 5 initiatives. And I've been, in fact, Tom came with me to one of the airports. I go to speak to TSOs at airports, and what they always say is, we wish the public would remember why they're in line and would be part of the process. And one of the ways they would love to do that is have posters to remind people why they're there and that they need to be part of security, not just the TSOs. But the problem is always the airports and the airlines. They will never let the airports or the TSOs put up any kind of information for people going through screening to say, we need your eyes and ears open, we need you to be part of this process, we're here for you. Can you tell me why the airports and the airlines are so against that?
Right now, if you look at the requirements, TSA prescribes what signage should be placed in and around checkpoints. Clearly, there's other areas where signage could be placed, but if you look at it, when you go through right now, there is signage saturation. And so I think, to your point, maybe there's an opportunity to go back and look at all the signs that are currently in place and see if there are some that could be taken away and others that could be added.
I do not know the answer to the question from the airline perspective.
We'll take a last question right here, the gentleman in the jacket.
I'm Mark Pearl, Homeland Security and Defense Business Council. I've heard a lot about, and I think that that's important, that we need to look at the passengers and we need to look at the baggage. But as we look back a few years ago, and we shouldn't always be fighting just the last war, there was an Egyptian airline issue with regard to the pilot. What are the domestic and or international standards or guidelines that are or not being followed when we look at the vestiges of Fort Hood, of people who are legitimately there and doing bad things? What's being done? What does the public know? What do the pilots know? What are the airlines doing to, in essence, ensure that this kind of disgruntled employee situation doesn't turn into a terrorist situation?
You're talking about the Egypt Air flight where the pilot flew it into the ocean, and so your question is, how do you make sure that doesn't happen again?
And what's happening in regard to that now with regard to standards that are going on internationally with regard to airline personnel?
Well, in that unfortunate specific incident, for whatever reason, that pilot decided to take his life, and everyone on the plane that day probably could not have been prevented. The FAA vetting that's going on now for airman certificates has certainly been more aggressive over the last year or two. I think that is a remedy. As far as people that have access, there's been proposed 100% screening of employees. I'll speak to LAX. We have 40,000 people there with badges. So needless to say that 100% screening of employees shuts down the airport. We have been able to at least randomize our screening of employees in certain locations throughout the airport unexpectedly, and interestingly enough, been quite successful with a whole host of things that have been identified. But you speak to a very interesting point with regards to trying to prevent that kind of act from happening. And that's a very good question, a very difficult task.
So if you look at the requirements for vetting of employees, they're quite extensive. All employees with access or pilots and crew members are subjected to a criminal history record check. They have security threat assessments that is vetted perpetually. And then, to Erroll's point, TSA has a program called its Aviation Direct Access Screening Program. It's a program to randomly screen employees entering sensitive areas of the airport.
The TWIC program, for example, hasn't been implemented as successfully across the board either, which is a major component part of an international ID system.
Yeah,
Every airport has its access control system, which relies on badges given to vetted individuals. And then the other piece of that is that I neglected to mention earlier, all individuals with access at airports are routinely vetted against the no-fly and selectee lists as well.
Okay, I think that does it. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Fair enough. My hands are freezing. Yeah. Sitting under this bed, you know.
I know.
Thank you all very much. Now we're going to have a break for about 10 minutes. See if we could reconvene at 11:30 for the maritime panel. Thank you very much, Tom.